Hello. Every accusation is a confession. That's how it is with the US. When it comes to geriatric leadership, press censorship, human rights, it's frequently as accurate, if not more accurate, for the US. Let's take a look at some concrete examples. Addendum. This is a representation of the very pure hypocrisy of common American ideological motifs, where certain conditions that stripped other nations of sovereignty, legitimacy, or other positive characteristics are entirely overlooked or even considered normal if they occur in the US. I'm contrasting American realities with the history of the USSR, not defending the mistakes or excesses of the USSR. Don't throw stones from glass houses, as they say.
But no, their idea, did you see the other day? I opened it up and they closed it again. I opened it, they closed it. Washing machines to wash your dishes. There's a problem. They don't want you to have any water.
Donald Trump is the oldest candidate to ever be elected president, surpassing even Joe Biden, who was the oldest sitting president before withdrawing. More accurately, being forced to withdraw from the 2024 race due to concerns over his mental ability. You're surely familiar with his verbal mistakes and frequent nonsensical quips.
And the kids used to come up and reach in the pool and rub my leg down so it was straight and then watch the hair come back up again.
Trump is now facing similar scrutiny. He is 78 years old at the time of writing. Just to contextualize how much that age is, he was 23 years old when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and 60 when Twitter was released. This is an old man. Worse than just his age is his cognitive ability. Trump has always been fairly cognitively challenged, but now he's just a little bit senile.
Let's say your boat goes down and I'm sitting on top of this big, powerful battery, and the boat's going down. Do I get electrocuted?
He frequently struggles with teleprompters, mispronounces words, and offers convoluted explanations to justify his erratic speech. His rants from time to time follow no discernible logic sequence, instead changing subjects randomly. He also frequently mixes up world leaders and even got Elon Musk's name wrong at one point. Putting Biden and Trump together as a series of American leaders that have controlled the US for nearly a decade at this point, it's more than evident that their mental deterioration is significant. Why though? Why are such old and inept people allowed to preside over the most powerful nuclear arms trade in the world? Simple. They're not actually running much. As Marx said, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. I've covered the details of this here, and my buddy Second Thought has covered it for the entire American system here. Regardless, this reminds me of something we're somewhat far removed from now, which is the age and mental acuity of the Soviet leader Brezhnev. Brezhnev was the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's Central Committee in 1964, later becoming the General Secretary in 1966. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union pursued a general policy of stability, focusing on maintaining the existing power structures rather than implementing reforms. He was an okay leader and presided over a fairly stable period of Soviet life. But by the later years of his rule, Brezhnev had become a symbol of so-called Soviet stagnation. His physical and mental deterioration was severe enough that state-controlled media couldn't fully work around it either, following a series of strokes in the 1970s. His speech was sometimes slurred, he made frequent mistakes when talking, so on and so forth, making him appear more like a senile old man than the leader of a superpower. He suffered a near-fatal stroke in 1976, but remained in power for 6 more years, experiencing periodic bouts of confusion. Here's the point we're coming to though. Internationally, Brezhnev's decline became a source of ridicule and concern. He was the symbol of so-called Soviet decline. He was used as an example of the issues of the Soviet system as a whole and its supposed inherent self-destructiveness. This was despite the fact that he was quite a bit more lucid than either Trump or Biden. Nonetheless, this drove impetus for younger and more energetic leaders to take the reins, which sadly ended up in Gorbachev as leader of the USSR by 1985 at 54 years old. That's a story for another time though. Age alone is not necessarily disqualifying, but when leaders begin showcasing clear signs of mental decline, the consequences can be very severe. At some point, the US state bothered to uphold a facade of competence and democracy while preventing any real change. Now it doesn't even bother to do that. The leader is so obviously useless, but is surrounded by enough corrupt special interests to prop him up, as was the case with Biden. Beyond Trump, the aging nature of US politics is evident across both major parties. The median age of voting members in the House of Representatives is 58 years old, while in the Senate it is an even higher 65 years old. Despite all of this, many sections of the American public, and even the US-aligned so-called international community, treated dealing with Biden and Trump as completely normal, as if nothing was wrong. No talk of inherent rot at the core of the US political system, no proof in the pudding of American corruption and decline, nothing even nearly close to the critique leveled at the Brezhnev leadership. much of it semi-warranted, of course, despite the Brezhnev leadership being far more competent in comparison. I guess it's just that American exceptionalism at it again. Back to the video in just a minute. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Incogni. Every year, dozens of data breaches worldwide result in sensitive data being exposed on the net. According to the 2022 annual data breach report by the Identity Theft Resource Center, the number of victims has gone up nearly 41% from 2021. Hundreds of commercial databases exist, selling your information without you even knowing. People's search sites can be accessed to find your name, social security number, login credentials, home address, location history, online activity, and much more. Anyone can access your personal information using people's search sites. It doesn't include just marketing companies, but also potential employers, landlords, or bad actors. The information can be used to take loans out on your name, by insurance companies to possibly raise your fees, by spammers to subject you to spam calls, or worse. So how does Incogni solve this issue? Incogni reaches out to data brokers on your behalf, requests your personal data removal, and deals with any objections from their side. Through an automated process, Incogni will make sure that your data stays off the market by conducting repeated removal requests. Whenever a new record pops up on a data broker site, Incogni will automatically take care of it. That's what makes Incogni's yearly subscription especially great. Incogni will continue protecting your data privacy for as long as you use the service. For my viewers, use the link below to get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. How do you get started? First, create an account. Grant Incogni the right to work for you by contacting data brokers on your behalf, and relax as Incogni requests your personal data removal, handles any objections from data brokers, and keeps you updated on their progress every step of the way. So what are you waiting for? Click my link in the description, get your 60% off an annual Incogni plan, and start protecting your data today. Thanks to Incogni for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video. The USSR was a horrific totalitarian hellhole where you couldn't write a knock-knock joke without getting approval from the Kafkaesque bureaucracy. Censorship was arbitrary, based on the whims of the leadership. You would need to call French fries Soviet fries if they decided, lest you suffer the wrath of the Gulag. I joke, but that was the common and very incorrect presumption, and probably still is in the US. There was indeed censorship in the USSR, and it could be annoyingly bureaucratic to get things approved depending on the content. I'm going to move past certain reasonable justifications for censorship, like censoring fascist content, and how many other nations do the same with little critique, and instead show the parallels of the US. The United States has long criticized the Soviet Union for its stringent restrictions on press freedom, but funnily enough, this controlled system bears striking similarities to the landscape of so-called press freedom in the United States today, where government interference, economic monopolization, and outright suppression are increasingly shaping the public's access to information. One of the most blatant recent examples of press suppression in the US was the Trump administration's indefinite ban of the Associated Press from the Oval Office and Air Force One. This decision was made in response to AP's refusal to comply with the administration's politically motivated renaming of the Gulf of Mexico to the stupidly named Gulf of America. The ban not only punished a major news organization for refusing to participate in state-sponsored narrative manipulation, but also directly interfered with its ability to report on presidential events. The AP has historically been central to White House press coverage, having helped establish the presidential press pool that ensures some level of transparency in government affairs in the US. By blocking the AP from participating in pooled events, the Trump administration effectively removed one of the most influential watchdogs from its orbit, limiting the public's ability to access independent reporting on government actions. The AP ban was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader campaign to intimidate and weaken the press. Trump had repeatedly threatened to use state power to silence critical media outlets, including proposing revoking broadcast licenses, launching government investigations into unfavorable coverage, and even jailing journalists who refuse to reveal confidential sources. These threats are not just rhetorical, they actively discourage journalists from pursuing stories that might put them in the administration's crosshairs. Even more concerning, Trump has actively enabled physical violence against the press. His violent rhetoric has had tangible consequences, with assaults on journalists nearly doubling in 2024 compared to the previous year, directly correlating with the peak of his campaign. Additionally, he has pardoned at least 13 people who were convicted or charged for attacking journalists during the January 6th insurrection, or riot, whatever you want to call it, sending a clear message that violence against the press will go unpunished under his rule as long as it benefits him. Now, you might think this is a Trump-only thing, but you'd be wrong. Press censorship, violence against journalists, and media blackouts are as American as apple pie, and you can delve deeper if you're interested here. Regardless, the current American regime's war on the press extends beyond traditional media. Its billionaire allies, such as Elon Musk, have taken control of key digital platforms, further tightening the grip on information flow. When Musk acquired Twitter, he dismantled existing safeguards and began arbitrarily banning journalists who criticized him. This was paralleled with Bezos' ownership of the Washington Post, where he said, "We are going to be writing every day in support and defense of two pillars, personal liberties and free markets." This reflects a growing trend where private wealth is used as a tool for political censorship, reinforcing the government's ability to control narratives without directly enacting legal restrictions. Let's not forget Lenin's great quote, "All over the world, wherever there are capitalists, freedom of the press means freedom to buy up newspapers, to buy writers, to bribe, buy, and fake public opinion for the benefit of the bourgeoisie." Nowhere is this clearer and more evident than in the US. Musk's platform has also become a breeding ground for disinformation, with verified accounts responsible for 74% of the most viral false claims about the Israeli genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. While the United States continues to present itself as a beacon of press freedom, reality tells a different story. The Soviets, in the more recent environmentally conscious era, have been rightfully criticized for certain industrial actions that have damaged ecosystems, from the Chernobyl disaster to the depletion of the Aral Sea. Again, these events are used to underpin a sort of ideological rot at the core of the Soviet experiment, framing them as justifications for endless criticism and condemnations of the USSR, many of which are warranted, particularly in this case. Similar, or even far worse disasters happening by or in the US, though, get practically zero ideological criticism in comparison, which is the point of this video, to illustrate this heavy double standard. Let's take a look at one of these. On April 20th, 2010, an explosion on the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig, operated by BP, led to a catastrophic blowout at the Macondo prospect in the northern Gulf of Mexico. This disaster resulted in the uncontrolled release of oil and gas into the ocean for a total of 87 days before the well was finally capped. Over this period, an estimated 3.2 million barrels of oil were released into the Gulf, along with several 100,000 tons of hydrocarbon gases, making it one of the worst environmental disasters in history. The spill was further worsened by BP's use of industry-friendly regulations, which were rubber-stamped by the Minerals Management Service, a government agency that had long been accused of corruption. MMS had a well-documented history of allowing oil companies to self-regulate, even allowing them to fill out their own inspection reports in pencil before tracing them over in pen. The agency's willingness to ignore safety concerns was particularly egregious with BP, a company that has had the worst safety record of any oil firm operating in the Gulf. The environmental consequences of the spill were devastating. A vast area of the Gulf became heavily polluted, with surface oil slicks at their peak covering more than 40,000 kilometers squared, and cumulatively spanning over 112,000 kilometers squared of ocean surface, an area larger than the country of Cuba. Over 2,100 kilometers of shoreline, including critical habitats such as beaches, wetlands, and estuaries, were contaminated, severely impacting marine life. Marine mammals, particularly dolphins and whales, experienced unprecedented deaths and increased strandings, signaling a decline in the overall health of regional populations. The same case was for sea turtles and seabirds, and deepwater coral formations. The response to the disaster was defined by short-term optics rather than long-term environmental protection. Instead of focusing on recovering the spilled oil, BP opted for an unprecedented deep-sea application of chemical dispersants to break the oil into small droplets, effectively pushing the contamination underwater rather than allowing it to be visible on the surface. The primary dispersant used, Corexit 9527A, contained toxic chemicals known to cause damage to the kidneys, liver, and red blood cells, raising concerns about human health risks for cleanup workers and local communities. Despite these risks, BP continued to use Corexit, a product manufactured by Nalco Co., a company with direct ties to both BP and Exxon, raising further suspicions about corporate self-interest being prioritized over environmental and public health. The Environmental Protection Agency initially allowed BP to use Corexit without intervention and only issued a directive to switch to a less toxic alternative on May 20th, which BP refused to comply with. By this time, it was too late. Oil had been dispersed into the water and was no longer able to be actually removed, and would continue to pollute the ecosystem. From the outset, the US government's response was characterized by deference to BP. The Obama administration initially insisted that BP alone was responsible for stopping the leak, with White House officials claiming the federal government lacked the authority to take a more direct role. Even when it became clear that BP had consistently underestimated the severity of the spill, government officials continued to echo the company's misleading figures, first reporting a flow rate of only 5,000 barrels per day, when scientific estimates suggested a much higher volume. When the Obama administration announced a pause on deep-water drilling, it only applied to 33 exploratory wells, meaning less than 1% of total operations in the Gulf. The administration's reluctance to take a stronger stance against offshore drilling was doubled down on when Interior Secretary Ken Salazar reaffirmed the government's commitment to moving forward with drilling expansion despite the ongoing crisis. In the end, the Deepwater Horizon disaster exposed a regulatory system that had been systematically captured by the oil industry, a government unwilling to hold corporations accountable, and a cleanup effort designed more to protect BP's financial interests than to mitigate environmental harm. Similarly, the use of dispersants shows a political failure to actually think in the long term. Instead, US politicians wanted to be seen as addressing such a publicly shocking incident without actually doing the hard work required. There was some amount of response to the Deepwater Horizon incident. BP did pay a slap on the wrist fine, some further regulations were enacted, and there was a government cleanup response. None of these things, however, went far enough, but they did exist. The US doesn't do this for the other countries damaged by its criminally negligent oil companies. Instead, the US state backs its corporations completely, and even those of international conglomerates, interfering with the rights of other sovereign nations to seek justice. This is the case of the Chevron oil spills in the Amazon, for example, often referred to as the Amazon's Chernobyl, but you've never heard of it, have you? Many of the freedoms and privileges that the United States prides itself on are, in reality, only accessible to those who can afford them. Inequality is the foundation of the US, and this is that way by design. This pattern repeats across all aspects of life, from media freedom to economic opportunity. Billionaire media moguls enjoy unrestricted press, but journalists and workers within the industry face constraints. The same logic applies elsewhere. To claim that something exists as a universal right, one must also ensure that people can actually access it. Take freedom of movement. For example, the USSR was criticized heavily because it was difficult to leave. Doing so required special exit permits, which were difficult to have granted and were dependent on the locations traveled to. This was not the case for tourism, mind you, and the USSR had a vibrant tourism industry, both within the Union as well as with allied nations. Regardless, the US, on paper, has had no such bureaucratic obstacles. Yet for many Americans, leaving permanently, or even for vacation, is still unrealistic, only for different reasons. If the right to leave a country you're unhappy with is truly a right, then it must be something people can realistically act upon. In the US, this right exists in theory, but is financially out of reach for many. The cost of an international flight, the difficulty and cost of securing a long-term visa, debt, amongst many other reasons. Even within the United States, many are only one paycheck away from financial ruin and couldn't afford a fresh start abroad, or going without a wage in the meantime. More importantly, in order to secure a long-term visa elsewhere, you need to show that you can contribute to the new country's economy. This could be by having enough money currently, or by securing desirable employment. With a crumbling educational system, many Americans wouldn't have much to offer any country they move to. Education, at all levels, was free in the USSR, and the fear was that the highly educated experts in various fields can become said experts for free in the USSR, only then to immigrate elsewhere for far higher wages and privileges. Is blocking this possibility a correct approach? I'll leave that up to you, but the reasoning is understandable, at least. The hypocrisy of the criticism goes deeper, though. While the US protects the rights to leave, it is extremely controlling of who may enter or stay. Historically, the US has welcomed those fleeing countries it opposes, but for refugees from less politically convenient crises, they are met with indifference at best, left to wait in endless queues, or turned away altogether. The US benefits so much from selective entry. It allows it to poach the most valuable workers from poorer countries by offering them better pay and conditions. This means that poorer countries spend the money on raising and educating someone, but the US benefits from their highly valuable labor. This is known as brain drain, and it's the real reason the US wanted people to exit the USSR freely. It wanted all their scientists and doctors without having to educate its own citizens. They never would have accepted impoverished Soviet migrants or refugees outside of political brownie points. Just look at how they treat their current desperate migrants. Back onto the topic of economic rights, one of the most frequent criticisms of the USSR was its lack of consumer goods. Few designer brands, few luxury cars. But how different is this from life for the average American, really? The vast majority will never own a sports car and never shop at high-end boutiques. Many will end up struggling to survive, as they currently do. The only difference is that they live alongside those who do live in luxury, walking past storefronts and advertisements that dangle wealth just out of reach. American capitalism doesn't eliminate scarcity, it disguises it. The illusion of abundance is sustained by the presence of luxury, even if most people will never access it. Similar points can be said about many of the USSR's flaws. They're only different if you're rich enough. See also the lack of affordable consumer goods, or long wait times for services. These things are the lived experience for millions of Americans currently. The difference is, in the USSR, these were under exceptional circumstances, while in the US it is increasingly becoming the norm. This is even more true for political participation, which the USSR is said to have lacked. This would be a cute point if the US political system wasn't so heavily skewed in favor of the rich, though. You may get your name on the register, but as a working class, low-income American, it's impossible to ever see your interests properly represented or see any meaningful changes because of your vote. Meanwhile, wealthy donors get to have massive influence, and the different shades of rich capitalists can have a whole so-called democracy to litigate their tiny differences. The research is clear on this. The US does not guarantee rights, it sells them. Freedom, opportunity, security, these are commodities available only to those who can afford them. And as for those who can't, they can just watch and believe that maybe one day they too will have access. This is the real export of American ideology. Not prosperity for all, but a world where inequality is accepted as natural, where the suffering of the many is justified by the luxuries of the few. The examples are endless. Every accusation is, in fact, a confession. Ideological brainwashing in media or education, well, the American military has a direct say in practically every movie you've seen. And just recently, more anti-communist so-called education laws have been passed in the US. Housing, well, Americans live in almost cardboard houses and have to pay several times their yearly salary for a halfway decent home. And those are the lucky ones not renting. And accessibility of services, well, access to education and healthcare in the US is next to dismal, particularly for the poorest in society. Prices of certain consumer goods or luxuries being outside the budget of regular families, well, take a look at the food bank lines and come back to me. Human rights abuses by police, censorship in society or the media, lack of political rights or participation, the list is endless. If you're interested in a heavy academic dive into the USSR for curiosity's sake, check out Albert Szymanski's Human Rights in the Soviet Union, a fantastic book. Remember, educating yourself is never a bad thing, and learning doesn't mean you need to, or even capable of, defending, whatever that means, a long-dead state. Use the knowledge to organize and improve your living situation, and that of your community. A better world is possible. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching.